Here is a video which I recorded over a little more than an hour of play. I cut out all of the hands in which I folded before the flop, but for those of you who are interested, there is a link to the raw footage of this session in the comment section. At the beginning of this session, I made some relatively aggressive advertising plays, which in a clinical sense might be slightly negative EV or break even, but which from a short-term metagame perspective are likely going to show a long-term profit by inducing future loose calls from my opponents. For example, King Queen 9-4-1 suit is a very marginal hand. Most 3-card hands, or tries, are practically worthless in pot limit Omaha. But opening on the button against 2-type players, you do not need much to raise, and this is a cheap, perhaps even profitable way of establishing a dangerous attacking image. You want your opponents to be both afraid of you and thus reluctant to try a bluff, but also suspicious and eager to call. To this end, you should focus your image plays on reinforcing their habits of making loose calls in passive check. Whether or not this value bluff with a weak mate hand, queens, and a very weak non-nut gut shot will show a long-term profit, having made these marginal bets will provide cover for the times I flop and bet monster hands or huge draws. Splashing around in small pots can also cause your opponents to make mistakes when there is more money in the middle, if they have derived some erroneous conclusions from watching me play. Most likely, if I am called, I should shut down on most turns, perhaps continuing if I pick up a 2 or 3, especially of spades, and of course betting queens and sevens. It is also less risky to try to steal from presumably passive opponents, because they are less likely to exploit my perceived weakness if I check unfavorable turns and rivers. In the next hand, I elect to check my aces from the big blind. In general, you do not want to do too much raising when you will be first to act on the next betting round, although raising this hand is also a decent option. I continue my strategy of betting marginal hands in small pots, and of course have no choice but to fold once my opponent makes a pot-sized raise. While it is important in general to avoid playing out of position, it is just as important to do what you can to get in pots with recreational players and to establish a history against them. Ace-King 9 in this situation is marginal. It might be slightly profitable, it might be slightly unprofitable. You don't have to worry too much about giving your opponent slightly the best of it on occasion, especially if they are willing to return the action and then some. It is in this vein that I raise Ace-King 3-4 and attempt to bluff on a Jack-Deuce-Deuce flop. Whatever the merits or demerits of this line of play, and whatever the outcome of the hand, I am going to inculcate a feeling in my opponent's mind that I am an attacking, aggressive, and dangerous player, and that they should feel free to call me down, but that I'm not the sort of person on whom you want to make a move. By this point, I had hoped to play a few more hands in an aggressive or bizarre fashion, but the opportunities did not present themselves. Despite this fact, I felt like I had established enough of a frisky image to shut down after bricking the flop. There is also some merit in showing down, having raised a hand with 3 wheel cards accompanied by disconnected paint. As your image becomes more and more tarnished, you must bluff less. Luckily enough, my opponent turns out to have nothing, and I win with the 5. In the next hand, I again check a strong hand from the blind, and again make a bet with a weak hand in a small pot, and even continue to stab on a turn which does not improve my holding. This is simply sticking to my strategy of splashing around in small pots, as well as remaining cautious about building big pots out of position. The cost of betting the flop or the turn in an absolute sense is very small, and my opponent is unlikely to exploit my river or check. One of the great things about online poker is that you get to see all showdown hands. Especially when I am two-tabling, I love to examine hands which I may have missed that went to showdown in order to draw conclusions about how my opponents play. While you do not want to make any rash decisions with regards to profiling your opponents on the basis of 1 or 2 hands, a qualitative analysis of their play can yield tremendous insight into their psychology and prove to be an effective tool in informing your future decisions against them. Even when the decision to bet is obvious, the amount to bet may require some consideration. Ace 10, Deuce 5 double suited is clearly profitable on the button against these two relatively loose players, and both the flop and turn bets with what is likely to be the best hand are no-brainers. On the river, perhaps sizing smaller is better, in order to squeeze a call out of an overpair or a 10. Most likely, my opponent missed some sort of straight or straight and flush draw. There are not really that many strong, but less than deuces full hands, which my opponent can have to pay off a large sizing. I can bet tiny to try to induce a bluff, but having bet at every opportunity, it is unlikely that my opponent would fall for it. The point that I want to make is that instead of reflexively betting a given fraction of pot, it is important to think about what your opponent is likely to have and bet accordingly. Both my flop and pre-flop calls with ace 9, 7, 6 are marginal, but I am in position and there's still a lot of money to be bet, and my hand in absolute terms is pretty decent before the flop. Unfortunately, my opponent 3-bets 2.8% of the time, and I have an ace in my hand. On the flop, I have not even one diamond, so if my opponent has a flush draw, then I will be in fairly bad shape. But I do have some backdoors in position, and this is not the sort of flop that a very selective 3-better will smash. If I do turn something like the 8 of hearts, then I have lots of favorable river situations. Of course, I turn gin, and since the pot is already big, I decide to shovel all in. 3-betting decent kings against a very aggressive short stack button opener is a no-brainer. As you can see by the graph, I will flop the best hand over 80% of the time, and only very rarely be in real trouble. What's more, my opponent will be unable to capitalize on the rare times when he does catch up, since we will be all in after a flop bet. This next hand gave me some trouble. I flop very good, but get raised by a passive opponent. Perhaps this is my aggressive image coming back to haunt me, or maybe he flopped a set. In retrospect, a fold seems reasonable, and coming over the top is likely a big mistake. At any rate, I decided to call. Perhaps my opponent has a wheel wrap, or 2-pair as well. The turn gives me an over gut shot and second nut flush draw, so I call again, but decide to throw my hand away on the river when I improve to jacks and tens. Most likely, going into the river, any king is the nuts, and any spade is almost always good. Fives and jacks will give me the best hand the majority of the time, although a set or ace-jack 5 is not that unlikely. My opponent having 3-4 from a wrap on the flop is also decently probable. All in all, this was a difficult hand, which sadly I lost. This rainbow aces hand is reminiscent of the decent kings which I 3-bet against the same player earlier. Again, we have an aggressive short stack opener. He's a little deeper this time, and our hand is better, albeit unsuited. As you can see by the graph, 90% of the time we will be either flipping or best. We are faced this time with a post-flop challenge. After he calls on the flop, I suspect he is likely to be slow playing me with the queen, but certainly once the flush shows up, it is advisable to check fold the turn. It might be possible for him to have floated this flop with a pocket pair, but most likely he flop trips or turned a flush. King-queen 10-2 double suited is very marginal, but I want to continue getting into pots with Briney, even if I am taking slightly the worst of it, and there is a non-negligible chance that the under-the-gun poster comes along with something hopeless. Probably this call is break-even, and so metagame considerations urge us to make it, especially at this relatively early stage of the game. On the flop, I have some nice draws, a weak made hand. Do not want to try to check raise the guy who is last to act, since he should take a somewhat cautious approach in this multi-way pot, so I bet and take it down. If called, this might have been a decent spot to check if I hit my heart, since most likely with a strong made hand like a set, my opponent would have raised the flop. Draws play a pivotal role in Potluck and Omaha, and you don't want to fall into the trap of playing them too passively. Queen-Jack 10-8 is a strong hand and of course should be raised. These rundown hands are very profitable. The flop bet here is marginal, but I could get a king to fold, and I do have 8-9 outs, backdoor clubs, plus the possibility of hitting trips or 2-pair. Perhaps I missed a bet on the turn, but ace-queen, queen-9, and 8-9 all got there, and my opponent could have a better 2-pair as well. It is never that easy to narrow down your opponent's precise holding in Omaha. There was no flush draw on the flop, and my loose opponent is probably not the type to easily lay down a strong hand like two pair. One advantage of checking the turn is my passive opponent may not be inclined to try to bluff with a weak hand or value bet too thinly. As it turns out, my opponent had aces, which he decided to just flat call with pre-flop. Most likely he should have 3-bet his hand, being short-stacked and thus less concerned about the rare occasions in which he gets outflopped, and in position, as well as because he held decent or okay aces, since he could make a straight with ace-jack or ace-4, and is in possession of a jack-high suit. For a third time, I 3-bet Brittany with a big pair. This time I have good aces and position, as well as some history since I have 3-bet him twice already, so there's a small chance he might spaz out and 4-bet with kings or some other hand. I flop gin and bet small, since the only draw is an inside wrap. After he calls, I'm left with just over one pot-sized bet left, so I decide to simply pot it, putting him effectively all in, as I would be pot stuck and unable to fold any river if I bet, say, half pot instead. Of course, it's easy to play when you flop the world, but this hand does illustrate the importance of planning ahead for future streets while you are making your flop and turn decisions. Queen 7-6-4 one suit is a very weak hand, and it's unpleasant to be against a short stack raiser with a very tight range. The good news is I have the best absolute and relative position, and Brittany will often be squeezed after the flop. It is also somewhat unlikely that Treble and I smash the same flops, and being in position I might be able to make up for the weakness of my hand after the flop, whilst playing against Brittany. I also do not mind giving either of these players action. Perhaps my flop check with the second nut flush draw is too passive. It's unlikely that Treble would check 3 aces, and with only 1.4 SPR, and maybe I can take the pot down. At any rate, the decision to check or bet here is not really that important. On the turn, of course, with the second nuts and everyone checking, I should bet to charge 2 pair to draw and to get value from lower flush.